welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for More Than Pronouns, a dialogue on trans inclusion in the workplace. My name is Sonia Hamid. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at Career Exploration and Education at the University of Toronto. Today's event is a collaboration between the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office, Career Exploration and Education, Alumni Relations, and Rotman's Institute for Gender and the Economy. Today's event is being live streamed and recorded. Following the event, short clips of the recorded discussion will be made available online on both the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office website and the Institute for Gender and the Economy website. Before we begin, a few technical notes. With webinars, it is possible that we will have some technical challenges, noise from the street or within our homes, or even a visit from some pets. Please bear with us. If the stream happens to freeze or drop, please wait a moment or two and we will sort out the issue as quickly as we can. Finally, closed captions are available for this event. If you would like to utilize this function, you can turn captions on by clicking the button labeled CC, which is located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can also turn captions off by clicking the same button. Some community expectations and guidelines. We are mindful of security concerns while using online platforms. If there are any major disruptions that interrupt our ability to keep control of the Zoom platform, Alison Burgess, Director of the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office, will ask everyone to log off immediately and the session will be closed and rescheduled. If there are any inappropriate verbal or written communications, those individuals will be removed immediately. We are asking that we as a community hold each other accountable for maintaining a space of safety, accountability, respect, and inclusion. Throughout the workshop, we welcome you to ask your questions using the Q&A feature below. Additionally, if you face any technical challenges during the webinar, you can use the Q&A function to ask our support team for help as well. The event today is a dialogue with our featured guests to explore themes that bridge two new and important documents that have been developed in the last year. A link to both of these resources will be shared now in the chat window. The first document, Your Journey, a Career Guide for Trans and Non-Binary Students, was developed in consultation with and at the request of trans and non-binary students and alumni. It is a first of its kind resource in Canada, developed by a group of professionals from career centers across U of T's 3 campuses in partnership with Career Exploration Education and the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office. According to the TransPulse project from 2015, 28% of trans Ontarians could not get employment references with their current name, and 18% were turned down for a job due to their gender identity or expression. The report also states that 17% of respondents have declined a job offer due to concerns around unsafe work environments. Your Journey recognizes and responds to some of these issues by providing strategies and insights that can support trans and non-binary students explore career options, apply for jobs, and navigate the workplace. The second document is called Transitioning Employers, a survey of policies and practices for trans-inclusive workplaces. This first of its kind study seeks to document the policies and practices applied by Canada's large employers to support trans and gender non-conforming people. A partnership between Pride at Work Canada and the Institute for Gender and the Economy at the Rotman School of Management, the report details the finding from a survey of 69 organizations across Canada. The results show that large employers are taking some first steps towards basic accommodations, but still have gaps in providing truly inclusive workplaces. I now want to introduce our moderator for today's event, Trick Horn. Trick Horn, she, they, is a Toronto-based researcher, writer, and multimedia artist. Currently studying at the University of Toronto, they are also a program assistant for Q21 at the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office. Lately, their research has focused on the complexities of trans subjectivity in a new media context. During the pandemic, Trick has primarily directed her energies towards building communities of care and practicing radical non-productivity. Trick will now formally open our dialogue today with the land acknowledgement.
Thanks so much, Sonia. So I'll begin with the land acknowledgement. For a moment, I want to think about the land I'm on, here just up the hill from the northwestern shore of Lake Ontario in Tkaronto, or what many of us call Toronto. This land is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. It is Anishinaabe territory, home to the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Ojibwa nations, and home to members of many other nations, including the Métis and Inuit peoples. On this land, the binary gender system we live in is a new idea. The strict rules that we follow or break, the arbitrary framework that determines if we are cis or trans or non binary, that leads to so much violence, is not native to this land. These rules and this gender system have been introduced in the last few centuries as a tactic of colonization and enforced with white supremacist violence. There's a wonderful lecture available on YouTube by Harlan Pruden, a Cree and Two-Spirit scholar, where he discusses the many words used by different Indigenous nations for their Two-Spirit members. In his lecture, Pruden says, where there's a word, there's a people. And I want to do my best to remember those people, those Ogokwa and Okitsitakwe people, as they are known on this land, who were targeted by colonizers for their nonconformity, who had their identities denied by the residential school system, and whose stories have been erased by colonial propaganda. I also want to acknowledge the Two-Spirit folks who are alive today, continuing these traditions in the face of ongoing colonization. As a settler colonizer and as a trans person, I strive to understand my place on this land and my place in the project of colonization. I must not take my life on this land for granted, and I must work every day to remember the history of colonization, to remember that the history of colonization on this land is not over, it is still being written, and that means that it can be changed. Finally, I want to remind us all, including myself, that trans liberation will never come on colonized land. So with that, we are very happy to welcome our three guests today. Jade Pichette, they, them, is an inclusion, diversity, and belonging professional. They serve as the manager of programs at Pride at Work Canada, a national nonprofit that empowers employers to build workplaces that celebrate all employees, regardless of gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Jade is one of the co-authors of Transitioning Employers, a survey of policies and practices for trans inclusive workplaces. Secondly, Christine Sue, she, they, is a queer, non-binary, gender fluid woman of color and is a U of T faculty of KPE and OISE alumni. They work in a variety of different communities wearing different hats. These hats include being a healing-centered movement coach with a body liberation approach and an anti-racism, anti-oppression trainer and diversity and inclusion consultant at Challenge Accepted. Thirdly, Bina Mistry, they, them, is a Toronto-based freelance illustrator and art director who likes to play with shapes and color. They're currently interested in making meaningful work that promotes the well-being of local communities. Their clients include Google, BuzzFeed, Simon & Schuster, Reader's Digest, and Avenue Calgary. Bina provided the illustrations that animate Your Journey, a career guide for trans and non-binary students. So, yeah, we can get into the panel now. But before we get into the intro question, I want to remind all the attendees that at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar, there's a Q&A function, and we'll be taking attendee questions later on. We have a few planned ones first. But yeah, so this is for all the panelists. The first question, what aspect of these resources, Your Journey and Transitioning Employers, would you like to highlight for folks today? Anyone can take that if you feel.
I can
yeah.
jump in.
Thanks
So
so
first off, thank you, Trick, for the introduction and for the acknowledgement of the land that we're on. I'd also like to point out that this is Black History Month and that our local trans community has been mourning the death of Sasha Dior, a Black trans woman who did a lot for our communities. And that that always needs to be honored, especially in these discussions of even these resources in terms of, who has the best access in regards to these resources and the workplace. So in terms of, I'll start with transitioning employers because that's what I actually wrote on. I mean, transitioning employers really was one of the first of its kind to actually look at what the policies and practices are of large employers in Canada, because I think there's quite a few who think that they're inclusive and publicly state, at Pride and all these places that they are inclusive. But this was really kind of delving into and a detailed look into those benefits policies, those practices, and what workplace are trans folks actually even trying to look to walk into. And the thing that we found quite often was that there was just a lot of tokenism in what that looks like and what that journey looks like, and that there were few actions being actually taken even among the organizations, because keep in mind, whenever anybody's reading this report, that the people who participated are organizations who already see themselves as on this journey, and not organizations who aren't even thinking about the journey, which most trans folks are actually employed at in terms of small and medium sized companies in Canada. So I think that's something to look at and think about when reading these resources. And also, I was very excited to see this career guide came out, because it is the first of its kind. So I'd love to hear from others about the guide.
Christine or Bina, feel free to jump in.
Sure, I'll jump in. And I kind of straddle different worlds in the sense that what Jade has just talked about is very much the experiences I've had having worked for larger employers, corporate employers, and also just employers who have won awards in HR on inclusivity. And, oftentimes that is unfortunately not aligned with my experience. So to kind of tie that into the role that I often take up, which is to support community, to also be a part of the intervention in employer workplaces, as a trainer, as a consultant. What I'll highlight is that, again, congratulating folks on this guide here, because it is certainly one of its kind, and I wish I had it when I was a student. But I'd say the first portion, especially in terms of being able to connect with yourself and connecting with others, I think that's first and foremost, being able to have both a good understanding and grounding of who you are and where you want to go, the type of work you want to do, and then figuring out what that industry is like going into it, and the types of people who will go into it. Because the other piece of being able to connect with others is both for looking for jobs. Certainly we know that how powerful networks are, and also connecting with others enough so that you have a community of support. Because the work that that folks have to do in a workplace, even if it's a queer-centered organization, oftentimes you will need to end up being able to connect with folks to build relationships and build that trust in order to ensure that if you do end up in a position that is very vulnerable, and not because of you, but because of the organization and the lack of policies or policies that are not appropriate or not working, you're going to need that community of support, of care, and people who you can lean on in order to, whether it's just to support yourself to get through that job, so that you can find another one, and or to be able to advocate for yourself in that workplace if you do seek to change the conditions that you're in that workplace. So definitely is possible to do that. I'd say, it's really unfortunate that for a lot of trans non-binary folks, we are seen as activists first, even though we don't want to be. And I say that as somebody who does this work, especially in the sports inclusion world. But also, that does get very tiring, and not everyone wants to be an activist or a trainer. So, I just want to affirm, that portion is really, really poignant, and so key to read through and to do that kind of self work first, so that you're well prepared going into, workplaces, so that you're not alone. Of course, also connecting with community can also be complicated and hard, especially for BIPOC. And so that is definitely something that I personally often try and put out and say, I'm here to help, here to connect, so that folks feel like there is definitely somebody who may be in the workplace for a little bit longer than you have, for the students who are on the call here. And we can definitely try and connect to ensure that you at least have one point of contact, or can hear about the different possibility models that are out there for folks who are gender diverse, and trying to figure it out, how to navigate this, what I call capitalism world, where you do have to work in order to, survive. So I'll leave it at that for now. I'm sure I'll share more later.
Yeah, thanks so much. And also, I wanted to say personally, Bina, I absolutely love the illustrations in your journey. I love them. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about these resources.
Thank you, Trick, for the compliment. I really appreciated the opportunity to work on that guidebook, so I'm glad that other people enjoyed it. In terms of highlighting an aspect of these resources, I wanted to highlight the part in the transitioning employers report. There's a section that calls out the fact that Black and Indigenous trans people are more likely to face harassment and poverty. And this is something that's really important that is often overlooked, because people often see the trans and non-binary experience as being something that's very one-sided, and that people believe that, all trans and non-binary people kind of face the same experiences, which is not true, especially when aspects like race and culture and ability and so forth come into play. And I'm neither Black nor Indigenous, so I can't speak to those experiences specifically, but I see time and time again how trans and non-binary people who are not white or don't fit into a specific European appearance are often overlooked and are treated more unfairly than everyone else in the community. And this is something that definitely want to highlight because it is overlooked often. And that's pretty much what I have to say on that.
Absolutely, and thank you so much. I think partly what we're getting at here is some of the very basics, and that's partly what I want to get into with our second question. Our event this afternoon is called More Than Pronouns, and on the team, as we were organizing, we talked a lot about that title, and I think we were worried it was a bit flippant, but considering that our audience is made up of, our attendees, I should say, are made up of students and recent alumni, but also employers, I think that people are still just wondering how pronouns work. So I think, if we could talk a little bit more just about the basics of trans inclusion in the workplace. I don't want to spend too much time focusing on barriers, but I think it's worth addressing the issue at a foundational level. So the second question is, what are the common barriers or challenges that you think that the attendees should know about when they consider trans and non-binary experiences in the workplace, or even in the job search? Again, that's to all panelists, of course.
I can jump in again if folks want. First off, I want to echo Christine's idea of this community of support, and finding your community of support is so important, because there are so many trans people on this call, and so sometimes, I want to talk to the employers too, but that is something that you really need to look at, is where are you going to get your support network, and are there people that you can see as your advocates and co-resistors in that workplace. But I also personally, I love the title. In the last month, I have gotten 3 requests for corporate webinars explicitly and only about pronouns. And I have to explain that is something that is part of a discussion, but it's not the discussion. The discussion is things like benefits policies, looking to make sure that they're actually trans inclusive. A number of benefits providers are actually creating trans inclusive plans at this point. So Sun Life, Manulife, actually have some of these plans that are explicitly trying to become trans inclusive. You need to be looking at your data. Like your data, if you do not represent and track your trans and gender diverse and non-binary communities, how are you going to know what their experience is, or if they're being left out? And I think a lot of employers, until one of their staff explicitly says, hey, I'm trans, they make the assumption that there aren't trans people there. And so employers really need to be proactive when it comes to these pieces like policies and data and benefits, and providing also these communities care, which sometimes can come through an employee resource group and sometimes has to be really informal. But I'll stop for other folks.
Go ahead and jump in, Christine or Bina.
I'll jump in. I think pronouns aside, thinking about access to washrooms for sure, infrastructure, those are, I'd say, the most common barriers, and employers will come up with all types of excuses and reasons why they can't accommodate. And so that's definitely something to be very mindful of in terms of how much do you care about the work you're about to do, and what are our alternatives that you can um, sort of figure out in terms of taking on a job that may perhaps have those barriers and challenges, to see whether or not it's going to be worth it for you. I'd say, mental health is super key. So it is definitely different from person to person. The other common barrier I'd say is in organizational culture. So I do a lot of work in that realm. And it's not not so much, so larger infrastructure barriers aside, it definitely comes down to like how well you can actually connect with the folks in the workplace. So, so it's a lot of the microaggressions that come up that kind of chip away at you every day. That's going to be a huge challenge. At least personally, I found that to be a big challenge, having gone from working for a queer organization to a federal corporate organization. And that was a huge takeaway for me. I mean, having worked for the queer organization, I was like, where am I going to go from here? Yeah, having been surrounded by a lot of queer trans folks, and then going into a very cis heteronormative type of workplace where there are people who are winning awards for having been in the organization for more than 20, 30, 40 years, like a very different culture. I'd say in those kind of what would be deemed as minor challenges that aren't written anywhere on paper. That's probably one of the biggest challenges. And I actually work in the HR department in that organization at that time. So it was very difficult to have gone through a lot of really intense barriers then, and left a mark for sure. So that also then informed my experience in terms of moving forward on where I want to work, how much I'm going to get paid for that job itself. My general rule now is if I'm not getting six figures, I won't work in-house anywhere. But that capitalism aside, again, I'd say that pronouns coming out is definitely something to navigate. Finding somebody at work where you can trust. And fortunately, in that workplace that I talked about, my manager was actually very supportive, and it was very meta. And she kind of had to be because we were running a management training program across the board. So she was held accountable to her actions. But we also just connected in general as people to people. And so I'd say it was a privilege and I lucked out in that sense that I actually felt somewhat supported going through the mess of HR proceedings in that workplace. And then having done a lot of consulting for both nonprofit and corporate organizations, I'd say that it's leadership management that becomes the bigger barrier in terms of um, almost forcing or pigeonholing trans non-binary employees to be the people to get leadership buy-in, because that will never work. And that should never be pressure put onto the employees to advocate for themselves. It has to be the organization's, so I'm talking to the HR folks on the line here, it has to be the organization's responsibility to take that on. To hire from outside, not, you know, not to sell myself here at all, but to understand the power dynamic that exists when you'd expect any employee, internal folks, to do any of that kind of inclusivity work. So that also includes the employee resource group. You know, just because it exists, it doesn't mean it is going to be effective. I mean, if anything, that should not be the go-to place for any type of diversity and inclusion work changes across the organization. It has to come from top down, and for the employees to then, of course, have buy-in. But at the end of the day, having done coaching for executives too, that is where I've seen the most success. So kind of tying in barrier and success here, the biggest amplification of change and for the positive is definitely from that approach. So I'll leave it there for now. Pass it on to Pina.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think Jade and Christine, you're both coming from more of a like a highly sort of structured employment sort of environment, it sounds like. So Bina, if I can jump in here, I understand that you do a lot of freelance work. So maybe you could talk a little bit about like what that means in terms of barriers and challenges in an unstructured type of work situation.
Yeah, so speaking from personally my like freelance experience, and this is something that's also referenced in the transitioning employers report, is the tokenization that is very rampant when it comes to freelancing. Sorry. So when you advertise yourself as anyone, an illustrator, creative, whatever, as someone who is trans and non-binary, you get sought out for work because you are trans and non-binary, which can be great, not great, because organizations want to hire people who are trans and non-binary because they understand that need, but at the same time, they want us to do work for either no pay or very little pay, which is extremely problematic because it's saying that you want us for who we are, but you don't want to actually value us. And this is extremely problematic because, yeah, for what I just said, it's very problematic. And I feel like I see a lot of calls for artists and calls for whatever, and it includes doing a lot of, oh, you know, we're holding submissions for this magazine publication and we want to hear from trans and non-binary people. Please submit completed works by this date and maybe you'll have a chance and maybe we'll give you a $50 honorarium. And it's like, no, you can't ask people to do spec work. You can't ask people to do work for free. You can't ask people to do work for very little compensation. And I feel like a lot of organizations just don't understand that this is not the proper way to do things. And what really you should be doing is you should be seeking out the people that you want to work with. Look through the reasons why you actually want to work with them beyond their identity, and reach out and say, hey, we like your work, whatever, we want you to do this XYZ project. Here are the details, here are the specifications. Here's our budget is ideally the preferred situation. Please have a budget. Please tell us what your budget is. We don't want to have to do the guesswork. And if you don't have a budget and you genuinely don't know what you should be paying, ask the person what would they typically charge for this project and try to like find some sort of understanding of what a proper compensation is. And if in the event that the person you want to hire is charging something that's over your budget, be polite, respond, don't ghost. Ghosting happens a lot. which is really unfortunate. It's really sad because when we're asked for quotes, people and the organizations find it out of their range, they'll just ghost. And it's disrespectful because we're putting in the effort to give you a quote and you don't respond. It's a little bit rude. And yeah, that's just the main thing in terms of like a common challenge from a freelancing perspective. Don't ask us to work for free, please. Reach out and talk to us. And that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah, thanks so much. Jade, when you were speaking on this question, you talked a little bit about data and about, like being proactive in that way. And we have an attendee question here, and I just want to highlight a little part of it. The attendee asks about inclusive practices, but also is wondering about employers feeling like it's none of their business that their employees are trans. And maybe you could, trans or non-binary, so maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
I think that's a great question, and to a certain extent, in some ways, it is none of their business. But when it comes to the reality of people interacting in the world, it's there. And not everybody leads with their identity marker, but many of us don't have a choice but to lead with our identity marker. And that's especially true for racialized trans folks. That's true for trans folks who are visibly gender diverse in whatever way. Like, I cannot go into a space and people not read me as trans. Like, it's and I've been out basically my entire life. Like, it's part of how people see me when I walk in. And so that's going to happen for employees as well, when they're on the job and if they want to transition on the job as well, because many people will only be able to do that in a financial way, in a safety way, once they know they have a confirmed job and position, that they'll feel comfortable to actually do that once they've seen that there are policies in place for people to actually do that. And so collecting the data, you keep the data private in a lot of ways, like when it comes to a person's legal sex, whether that's or legal gender marker, depending on the province, how they define it, being male, female, or X, that is just the legal status that you need to know for your benefits policies. And that's it. It can be kept private in HR, not released in any type of employee profile of any way. You do not need to put gender in those employee profiles. But also when we look at employee experience, employee experience surveys have gone back quite a number of years. Thank you to the civil rights movement and the feminist movement of the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, who actually made these a reality, because there were court cases in Canada, the US, UK, all over around discrimination. So if you don't know the experiences of your employees and break that down as well, you're not going to be able to make an inclusive culture like Christine was mentioning. You're not going to be able to make sure that all of your employees feel valued, and feel safe. And that's going to have, for the corporates on the line, that's going to have an impact on your bottom line. Like, at the end of the day, like, diverse organizations where people feel safe to be themselves produce better results. Like, that is a fact at this point. And so when you're looking at that data, breaking it down and looking at, how do my trans employees feel? How do my queer employees feel? How do my Black employees feel? How do my Indigenous employees feel? How do my Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer employees feel? Because that is more of a guidance of how you need to move forward. And if nobody's identifying as such, that also spells a problem, because it either says that people don't feel safe enough to fill in that data because they think that somebody is going to see it, or they are so identifiable, you know, because of all their intersections, that they're worried they're going to be seen. Or people just don't feel safe doing it in general, and that sense of safety, if you're not seeing that through the survey, you know, also speaks volumes and also showcases that there is a problem there, because you're going to have trans staff, especially if you're a large employer. Like, if your staff team is maybe 3 people, maybe you won't. But if your staff team is like 500, 1,000, 20,000, 80,000, you are going to have and already have trans employees, regardless of whether they're identifying themselves. And so I work with a lot of employers about data. Honestly, I never thought, coming from a social work background where I love qualitative data, that I would spend so much time on quantitative, but here I am. And that is something that people really need to be aware of. And I also want to just echo what Bina was saying in terms of valuing yourself, from the perspective of the of trans folks who are on the call. You know, valuing yourself is important. I don't know how many things I did when I was younger that were for free or $50 or $100, that these days I can charge 2,500 for, you know, for that same session that I was charging nothing for before. You know, really values yourself. Talk to other people who are independent creators, or independent folks, and make sure that that's respected. And that goes into salary discussions with your employers as well. So.
Thanks so much, Jade. Yeah, and there was another question from the attendees about professionalism, and what, like, personally, I have a lot of feelings about even the word professionalism, but this person was asking, I'll just quote, any advice for navigating the feeling that your gender presentation experiences and values are out of line with, quote, professionalism standards in a given industry? And maybe I'll throw that to Christine, but maybe we could all talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So first off, just to like validate and also to affirm, like, oftentimes professionalism is deeply rooted in respectability politics. So what is deemed as respectable, what is deemed as appropriate, and there's a particular sort of box that that often is unwritten, unspoken, but it is there. So we're generally thinking of like the most privileged of positions of people in terms of social location or social positionality. So we're thinking white, we're thinking cisgender, straight, likely men or masculine presenting. And so operating from that standpoint, how do you navigate sort of going into a workplace where you don't see yourself reflected? I'd say, you know, again, it goes back to self-care and being able to self-validate and saying like, you're dressing the way you need to dress in order to do your work, whatever that makes you comfortable. And I'd say for the most part, if you're working from home these days, I think that line blurs a bit for many folks. But in terms of having to dress a certain way, to say go into a corporate space, you know, look around to see what is represented in the space. So if it's very sort of traditional, men wear suit and tie, sort of women or feminine presenting folks wear sort of dresses or sort of suits, pencil skirts and whatnot. I'm talking about the most business formal, and I'm saying it with quotations because honestly, as trans non-binary sort of community and as a non-binary person, that can look so many different ways. And we are, let's just say, so, from time to time, I have to tell myself that we're leading the way with fashion, and we are very fashion forward, as a pal would always say. And we're carrying the genders of the future, you know? So it's really important, like I said, to going back to self-care, having folks around you to validate how you feel and look, wearing the things that you want to wear. Of course, I'd say one thing is to wear things that feel more fitted. Again, quotations, because what is fitted, right? As somebody who experiences thin privilege, and I am generally deemed as more athletic, got broader shoulders, I am able to access men's clothing. And so that is a privilege in and of itself, I'd say, especially for folks who are operating outside of gender norms, because I'd say I would pass in a lot of times in contexts, that go with a pal if you can. If you're an independent person, you're facilitating something, or presenting a workshop or presentation, if you're able to do that with somebody, that is best case scenario. Do it with a pal, so that somebody who can also advocate or just show up with you. If that means going to an interview with a buddy, just have your sort of support on the side and saying you're going to do great, and making you feel confident. I'd say confidence is key in terms of being able to show up into a workplace, and perhaps looking outside of the norm in that workplace, is just to build up that confidence level as you enter, because that's what people will remember at the end of the day. After an interview or after an interaction, and your skills will come forward in terms of being able to um, get a job, and or land a gig. And of course, there are definitely other safety measures in order to then sound and feel professional. So there's sort of some strategies to work around that sort of respectability politics. So if there are people who are saying that, or giving you looks, right? I'd say that's the most common one, giving you looks because your representation is making them feel uncomfortable. Remember, again, self-care, that is not you, that is on them. That is a problem for them to deal with and not a problem for you. Unfortunately, looking for a job, that means that that employer is already uncomfortable, and that frankly isn't an environment you want to work in either. So those are sort of some key takeaways in terms of reflecting on any interactions you've had, that it isn't on you that you did not seem professional. It's more so that the other side is likely transphobic and cissexist, and they're not a great employer to work with. Of course, that limits where we can go with the work that we want to do. I work a lot with tech clients, and definitely have heard from folks about sort of the bro culture that comes out of especially the engineering, science, STEM type sort of environment. And oftentimes the success stories I've heard about is very much folks being very stern on like self-asserting, and saying, this is the way I am, accept it or leave it. And if you leave it, if you say things about it, that's where I think, referencing the guide here, knowing your legislative protections is number one, and so key. Number two is getting testimonials from folks. So if you know anybody who has worked there, or seeking out people who are or have worked there, to just ask about that culture of what professional looks like. That'll give you a lot more information about how you can, at minimum, dress the part if you really want to get into that workplace, to look the way that is more acceptable, and then ease your way in terms of like being more, and also of course assessing your safety, right? Being more open about how you definitely want to dress. And even saying that feels problematic because ultimately, ideally all trans non-binary people can show up to work and just work and not have to worry about how they look, and what people will say about how they look, just because that they are gender non-conforming, or that they don't fit a particular gender role or gender presentation. And this includes also BIPOC communities, how we present our hair, especially thinking about, I have a lot of connections with folks who are Indigenous Two-Spirit, and a lot of times that means like more masculine folks will have longer hair, and that is something to navigate in a workplace at times, or showing up to work in a different clothing attire for, celebrations or anything like that. Definitely have had some conversations about that too, in terms of the intersections of different identities and different cultural practices. And so You know, all of that very much talks and touches on respectability politics. And it's, again, going back to finding your people in a workplace, if you're already in a workplace. And if a manager or HR person comes to you and say, hey, like, we don't like the way you dress, that it is definitely a red flag to ask around, ask your people around, like your community, to just ensure that you feel secure and confident with what you're wearing. Document those things, document those interactions. So emails to yourself, documenting the time, the type of conversations were had, and if you see that somebody else is dressed in a similar way, but of a different gender and not at all getting the treatment you're getting, then you know that likely it is an equitable treatment, and there are protections behind you, and that's definitely something where, again, you're going to have to seek out for community support. There's tons of folks. I've also seen some lawyers who are very much open to help. I've definitely helped some folks too in the Jobs for Queers Facebook group, where folks have asked questions about this, and a lot of it has to do with sort of self-validating work, and also thinking about what you have behind you to leverage in order to move forward, so that you don't personally have to change yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine. I think there's a lot there, and like it's interesting to think about like visual presentation specifically. I think also professionalism comes along with a lot of sort of values and like social cues as well. And I'm wondering if Bina and Jade, like Bina, I personally, I just a personal perspective, I've been driven out of structured workplaces by professionalism standards. And so I end up doing gig work and I end up doing freelance work. And so like, maybe, I don't know if you have maybe some thoughts about like professionalism outside of structured workplaces that you could comment on, even just like communications. And I also know that sometimes in freelance, like social and work communications become a little bit strange sometimes too, if you have any comments on that.
So I'm not sure if this completely answers the question, but I'm going to be talking specifically off of my experiences, but I will have instances where people will misgender me in emails and even phone calls and this happens mainly if this is not established from the beginning that, you know, these are my pronouns. So this gets frustrating because, you know, you don't want to be misgendered. And a lot of professionalism has to do with, you know, how you interact with someone, especially when there's a power dynamic. And going back to what Christine was saying on self-care, it's, you know, if someone misgenders you in an email or in the middle of a call, like you're well within your rights to correct them. And it's not unprofessional for you to do so. And sorry, I forgot what I was gonna say on that part, but it's not unprofessional for you to correct someone if they misgender you or use the wrong name or whatever. And also in freelance work, this is speaking specifically on a perspective of what I do, which is illustration. But I'll have instances where a client will ask for revisions where, you know, I will intentionally try to draw people who are more diverse in their gender. And I will get requests that, oh, we don't want that. And so it's up to you now to, you know, you have to defend your decisions because you don't, you want to be professional in your job as an illustrator to do what the client asks for, but also you don't want to, you know, bow to a transphobic request. And I had a situation a couple years back where I was drawing an illustration. Someone asked that the people in the illustrations look more gender neutral. And I was like, well, that's not really a thing that exists. Like, you can't tell me that the people that I've drawn are not gender neutral. And so a lot of people will think that if they assert themselves, it's unprofessional, but it's not. It's not unprofessional. You just have to understand what your rights are and what is reasonable for you to ask for and what is reasonable for the other party to understand. And yeah, that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, yeah, I think what for me, it's important to highlight how these cultures of professionalism and therefore cultures that can become barriers are not just with one or two things. It's kind of like an entire culture. In terms of communication and also visual presentation and also social situations and just like the little soft things that happen informally too. But maybe I'd like to move forward and maybe reframe the question a little bit, and I'll direct this to Jade. Are the Speaking about professionalism, I'd like to talk about what a trans-inclusive workplace could be, and about like how can, from an employer's perspective, how can professionalism be incorporated in a way that is trans-inclusive, maybe?
So, I mean, first off, employers need to recognize what gender expression in human rights codes actually means as a start of that. And you know, a big piece of that is when we were talking about like this piece of professionalism of what's considered professional, dress codes in particular. I have come across too many where they still have, this is the male dress code and this is the female dress code. And especially the law firms I found have been some of the ones that have actually had these policies and have been moving forward because they know the legal ramifications now. And so really, you know, talking about what is, you know, having a real discussion about what is professionalism when it comes to clothing in that workplace, and keeping it very brief and keeping it for all employees, regardless of gender. Really is an important piece, and some of those companies that I've worked with have actually just gotten rid of their policies around that, around clothing, because people know what works for them in the workplace. You know, people know what is professional for them, and that's something that I think each person needs to kind of figure out. But it's, you know, respecting that diversity among your employees, and having a very firm way of addressing it when stuff comes up. So I think of one company, and I had a private consultation with them, so I'm not going to say who they were, but they were stuck doing using a gender dress code because they were contracted out by another company who had it, and they had to use it as part of the contract. And so the way that they dealt with that is that they created this accommodation policy, and every person who needed accommodation, so they were non-binary, they were trans, they weren't whatever that might be, gender diverse, they would actually get a card that says, what I am wearing is professional, according to HR. If you have any questions, here's who you talk to. And it had it so they had to go directly to HR, and that person then was not in a place where they had to explain their outfit. They didn't have to explain how that was professional for them. And you know, really putting the onus back on the employer itself. But I also think that, you know, a big piece of creating these spaces is also just listening to trans employees about what we consider professional for ourselves, you know, and like, as long as you're being respectful, that's what's important, right? Like, as long as you're being respectful. And so if people are being impacted in some of the ways that, you know, Christine and Bina have talked about, it's on the employer to address that with other employees. And, you know, an inclusive workplace will provide that space, and also follow the needs of that trans employee. So does that trans employee say, like, I would like people to go through training? do they say, I would like to have a restorative justice session where we actually get to have a communication between each other and talk about what the impact of that was? Do I want you to just go and deal with it in a way and never talk to me again about it? You know, like what works for that employee? And I think that is the piece that makes a workplace inclusive, is, you know, going back to what Christine was saying at the beginning of the session, you know, this leadership from the top, where they are role modeling what that inclusive leadership is. And, you know, that can start with them putting pronouns in their signatures and the like, but then moving beyond that, right? Moving to these places where you're truly protecting those employees, and many people will, the way that they'll deal with that on an institutional level is creating a trans inclusion policy. And the Creating Authentic Spaces guide by the 519 is a good roadmap for that, in addition to obviously transitioning employers. But that is a good roadmap of how you kind of create that policy, and also explicitly writing examples in your workplace harassment policy regarding trans people, you know, regarding gender diverse folks, you know, and explicitly showcasing that, you know, misgendering, critiquing their dress, you know, critiquing those types of things are not done. You know, and so really kind of creating that space where it's explicit, also for all the people in HR, because, you know, HR isn't necessarily an inclusive profession. In my experience, it's actually a very not inclusive profession, and I think if you attend any HR conference, you will also know that in terms of how much inclusion diversity is actually there. But inclusion diversity is so often put within HR, and they should be separated out just on an organizational basis. But, you know, making sure that those HR folks explicitly know how to deal with those situations, and then it's written into your policies.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think partly our discussion is revolving around, one part of it is self-advocacy and sort of the difficulties of that. And I'd like to direct a question to Christine. How can employers help people in their self-advocacy? And I want to be clear that personally, I'm terrible at self-advocacy, and like I've never been good at it. So I mean, I think that includes also, for people like me, having a way to do it that is a lot more accessible. But anyways, if you could speak on that a little bit.
Sure. First off, I also want to affirm, like, we don't have to be good at self-advocating because we have to do it every day. Like, that's why we're tired. That's why it feels like we suck at it, because it's every day. So I think so much of, like, you know, kind of building on Jade's point around like taking off that burden, right? Like, so much of our just simple existence is often resistance, and so that, of course, self-advocating is very hard and it takes such a toll. It's so vulnerable. Um, it should not be part of, in the sense of like being able to just say, hey, I exist the way that I do, right? Not so much as like, hey, can I take a 15-minute break at 3 o'clock? Like, that might be a bit different, but for sure, I'd say number one, if we're in that realm, like, give it a try in your own personal life. If you have, if you struggle with general self-advocacy for self-care needs, because I know it's very hard, we get messages that tell us we shouldn't, start with small things. And then in the workplace, depending on how well connected you may or may not be, again, if you have a buddy who's very much like, hey, how are you? And like checks in on you on that very surface level, but does that on a consistent basis, you know, that may show that this person cares about your well-being, at the very least, as a colleague. And you can maybe ask them to have a conversation around like, hey, you know, I'm having some of these experiences at work, and I'm having a hard time self-advocating. What do you think? And then practicing what you want to say, perhaps to a manager, with that person, in terms of thinking about your conversation with a manager. So what I'm kind of referencing is script writing, practicing what you want to say in terms of what your needs are is number one. So if you're thinking, so kind of just reading through the question Q&A section, there's some questions around pronouns and misgendering. So, you know, you're experiencing people misgendering you, you know, using that as an example, go to that pal who doesn't misgender you, and you can kind of practice that verbal processing and think about what you want to say, maybe perhaps to your manager or HR person to say, hey, like, this is my experience and this is my need for the organization to act up or for the manager to do something about it. Because at the end of the day, the best manager will be somebody who will support you and will care about your well-being. And if they don't care about your well-being, then that's a whole different discussion. But for sure, that's sort of one example to go about self-advocacy work. If you're having to self-advocate for like having access to a bathroom, now we're going into more of that potential legal category of thinking about what are your rights, what are your protections, and how are people handling that conversation. And for sure, if you're in Ontario, OHRC, they've got some supports there, legal aid, local community clinics, legal clinics. I know the 519 has a legal clinic as well. Parkdale has a legal clinic that I personally have been referred to go to in the past. I haven't been, but for sure I've heard of folks who have gone there. So you know, putting it out on Facebook or social media where you know that there are other queer community members who are around, just to ask like, who can I speak to get some help? So that you know what's behind you in terms of leverage, and be able to then go to your HR and say, hey, like, this is not okay. I'm having to go to Starbucks at break time, and this pisses off my own experience, but to go pee, like, that's not great, right? That's you know, self-advocacy is such a broad sort of category, so I'm kind of drawing in from like experiences I've heard of and personal experiences here. There are other ways of doing self-advocacy work in terms of like, it goes back to self-validation work and being able to like fully write down your needs. What are your needs, basic needs in a workplace or in any given space that you're going in and out of, and talking to somebody about it for sure, getting help because frankly, I personally don't believe that this can be done as a single human. Obviously, it's different when it comes to freelance work. I'm also somebody who freelances. You know, Challenge Accepted is a company that I co-run with a couple pals, and I have been blessed with these pals who I technically trauma bonded with. So I have that attachment with these folks and trust and safety. But for sure, as you know, folks who are going into freelance work, maybe you're asked to do workshops, present, because I feel like every trans person probably has been asked that if you are out at any point. That advocating, self-advocacy work means that you have to go out there and see what people have advocated for. And giving yourself permission to be able to do that. So for sure, the amount of money you're getting paid for a gig, for the supports you might want. Maybe you bring a pal the first couple times you're presenting on the side. Sometimes here's a behind the scenes secret for any sort of specific panel discussions that I may be moderating. I actually bring at least one person that I know is a minimum can show up in allyship, if not some folks who are who have lived experience, and they go sit in the audience to ask the questions later on to ensure that there aren't super problematic things that pop up, but that are meaningful for the audience to hear about. So there are many different ways to self-advocate for your own needs. And I think it all comes down to like being able to practice it with people who are supportive around you, and going into community and just posing it as a question. I've seen that pop up in like trans non-binary groups as well, and asking for different strategies, because it's going to be different for everybody. Yeah, just try not to do it alone is, I guess, the main takeaway, because there are people who are very happy and willing to help.
Yeah, Thank you so much. I think for a little bit, I'd like to talk not just about the workplace, but also about the job search. And maybe I can direct this question to you, Bina. When you are, before you're employed, can you talk about some like hallmarks of like an employer that you want to work for? Does that make sense?
That's a good question. Well, I guess this is a very personal answer, not a broad one, but I'd say like an employer that I want to work for is someone who doesn't make a big deal out of my gender identity in a way that's not like very showy, in a way that they're not trying to make it about them. And like Jane Christine has said, like in a way that focuses your identity actually on you, the person who is trans or non-binary. I haven't had a lot of professional experience, so I can't speak too much about this, but that is the main thing for me. Like I've had an employer in the past who would always ask me like, when will you come out to your family? And I'm like, it's not your business. Like I don't know what, because they thought that it would empower me to be out to everyone and use my gender identity as a way to boost my career. But I'm like, no, that's not how it works. It's not how it works for me. It's not how I want to do things. And so the big thing for me was just, someone who actually respects my gender identity and what I want to do with it, and my control and my autonomy of my own identity.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It reminds me of a manager I had who was really into being an ally. Was like really wanted to do it right, and I was using they them like only at that time, and I had like used a word I hadn't used around her before. I called myself trans, and then like later, like 2 hours later, she took me aside and was like, "Hey, you used that word, and like I'm just wondering, like, are you gonna change your pronouns again?" And I was like, it just made me so uncomfortable because she was trying to do the thing. She was trying to, do the right thing because she wanted to make sure that I knew that I could. But also it's like, it's weird. It's weird. It's none of your business. So I guess personally for me, partly something that I think gets lost in discussions about inclusion and allyship is that for me, my gender is super normal. Like this is a normal thing for me. I live this every single day. It's not actually like it's not an exciting thing that we can talk about necessarily. I mean, sometimes it is, but that's not at work. So that's it, and that's my little anecdote. Again, to bring it back to like the job search, Jada, I'll direct this question to you. One of the attendee questions was about onboarding and how we can better recruit trans and non-binary employees. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
For sure. And just to echo what you were saying, Trick, just because this is new for you doesn't mean it's old for me. And for some of us, it's very old. So in terms of the onboarding process, so we actually did a research study back in 2018 about the experiences of LGBTQ2+ job seekers called Hiring Across All Spectrums. And the number one thing that we got when it came to LGBTQ2+ folks, what their number one thing they looked at was the policies and procedures of that organization. The last thing, pride. At the very, very bottom, below everything else, was participation and pride. And I think often people who are in recruiting departments, HR departments, really, really do want to recruit LGBTQ2+ folks, want to recruit trans folks, want to recruit non-binary folks, but every part of your process is the thing that stops them, right? So, it's from that initial forms that people have to fill out. It's from the fact that they get misgendered when they're talking to recruiters. So, some of the things that I suggest, other than obviously changing your full workplace culture, creating a inclusive space, because that will recruit more people than anything that you do on a front-facing basis. quite honestly. But there are some things you can do on a front-facing basis. You know, make sure that you're getting out to these trans-specific job fairs. So, for instance, in Toronto, there was Trans Workforce, a trans-specific job fair that did happen in Toronto. There's also LGBTQ2+ job fairs that happen all across the country. There's a one coming out of Montreal that's virtual, you know, in a couple of weeks. So, you know, get into those spaces, but also make sure that anybody you're sending into those spaces is trained, you know, is trained on how to be inclusive and how to role model inclusion as well. You know, like not to go back to pronouns, but you know, if I'm at a job fair and that person has their pronouns on their name tag, that is going to signal to me bigger than anything else that they do on that in that moment anyway, that that is a place that I can go, that I will feel safer, and that there will be an actual discussion. And so I've seen recruiters who've started to do that actually with their when they're out at job fairs or virtually. But it's also your online process, right? If you're hiring people online, like we have a job board. But really, at the end of the day, people need to be able to go through that process in an easy way. You know, when they're filling out forms, do they have to fill out if they're male or female in that initial process? Because in a lot, they do, especially if they're federally regulated employers. And so, you know, taking those pieces out, making sure that people are trained, being clear if you do have to collect those pieces of information, why. So, you know, putting caveats in your training, like we recognize that these do not look at all genders. However, we're required to collect them for this and this reason. This information will, however, be kept private. And so making sure that that is welcomed throughout the process. Also, you know, having a section for chosen or preferred name is more inclusive for everybody, right? Like the amount of people who go by Dave, even though their name's David, you know, like they're welcome to put in their preferred name in those spaces too, and it makes it more welcoming for everybody. So just to kind of sum up, you know, make sure you're getting out to spaces, make sure all your recruiting folks and also hiring managers are trained. Make sure that there's you know, this inclusive process. And then the final thing I will mention is also mentorship. You know, recognize that trans folks may have gaps in our resume. I don't know how many trans folks I've talked to who have said, well, they just told me I'm not quite the right fit, or I'm an unconventional hire. And some of these people have PhDs. Like, I'm like, you're the unconventional hire. You're super experienced. You have high education, and yet you're still not the right fit in an unconventional hire. So, you know, really trying to make space for mentorship of trans community members in your organization, and looking to provide those spaces, whether that's like an internship program that potentially leads to permanent employment. You know, really trying to make space for that and develop people, and that's true for a number of marginalized communities, right? And so, you know, that mentorship shows that leadership and provides that safety, so that people will not only come in, but they'll stay.
Thank you so much, Jade. Yeah, so we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to get some closing thoughts from each of you. I understand, Bina, that you have a little bit of a tight schedule today, so I'm going to direct this to you first. But if you have any closing thoughts, partly as a conclusion question, I wanted to ask. You know, I think there's a difference between accommodation and like actual inclusion, and maybe we could talk a little bit about like how can an employer move from accommodating trans and non-binary employees to actually including gender diverse people. Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this. I would say, so going from accommodating to including, meaning that, so from my like freelance experience, I'd say like accommodating a trans and non-binary person means, you are hiring this person because you're looking to hire more people who identify as either trans or non-binary. And then including trans and non-binary people means that, you're hiring this person because you are looking to hire more people who are trans or non-binary, but you also actually are interested in their work beyond their gender identity, and you're interested in hearing their thoughts, not just on their gender identity, but on things beyond that and how gender interacts with the world around them, and just thinking of people who are trans and non-binary as fully multifaceted people who are not just their gender identity. I know this is me repeating what I've already said, but that's pretty much the bulk of it, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Christine, maybe could you go next?
So I'd say a quote came up in my mind from George Day, who said, inclusion isn't trying to include people into the system that already exists, but that it is recreating a new system that works for everybody. So, just to add on to Bina's point, like you want to hire people for what they can do, what they want to do, and build them up for their potential and for success. And that's, I'd say, the most important part. One thing I'll add to sort of the previous conversations is that when you're thinking about recruiting and hiring trans non-binary people, you have to think about why you're trying to hire trans and non-binary people, because that thought process in and of itself is already tokenizing us. And so it's important to think about also diversity and inclusion as a whole, and as intersectionality, is always in existence, right? As somebody who's racialized, I never just experienced transphobia or sexism. I also experienced racism altogether. And this is me living in downtown Toronto, operating mostly in sort of the GTA area, more recently anyways, working with a lot of like tech clients and healthcare and all of that. And so it's really, really important to take that intersectional approach to working to diversify your workforce at large and not have 10 employee resource groups, because that's just siloing the work itself, and it's making people like me and other folks, and especially Black, Indigenous, Two-Spirit folks, to then have to choose, and that's pitting us against each other. In terms of trying to advocate for all of our work forward, for a more inclusive workplace. So it's it's really important to have those key conversations around like, what do you want your workplace culture to look like, sound like, and feel like? Because ultimately the most inclusive, and I'll leave folks on this point, the most inclusive practices are practices that's going to benefit everyone at large. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love that final thought. Jade, go ahead.
So I will direct people to page 7 of the Transitioning Employers report, because we actually have a listing there of what's accommodation versus what's a truly inclusive environment. And that was something that was important for us to really put there and be clear about. One of the things that, obviously we've talked about the importance of leadership. Leadership is so important to make an inclusive workplace. I've seen a workplace go from an organization that was doing nothing in regards to inclusion and diversity to a workplace where, everything was moving suddenly on every front in terms of really restructuring, creating new spaces, looking at policies and practices of all types. But one thing that I would explicitly mention is also recognize that trans inclusion and non-binary inclusion is the job of someone in that organization. And that is something that came out of the Transitioning Employers report, is that we asked who's responsible for trans inclusion or non-binary inclusion at your company. And in many cases, we were talking to the head of HR, we were talking to the head of inclusion and diversity, we were talking to senior VPs and higher, we were talking to very senior people, and they said, well, there isn't one. And sometimes these were the people who were the leads in inclusion and diversity for their organizations. So make sure that that is clearly part of the mandate. Make sure that, you know, trans inclusion, non-binary inclusion is not just seen as something that you need to do, but is something that is required for you and a value for you. And, you know, as I think our entire conversation has reinforced, is also do that with intersectionality in mind. You know, none of us are just one identity, and that has to be taken into account. So, for instance, almost half of trans people, according to some of the Trans Pulse surveys, are disabled. I am one of them, you know, and so, you know, that is also an intersection to be thinking about and looking at. So make sure that somebody is responsible, and make sure that there are people who are accountable. Make sure that you're accountable to your staff, and that it's clear what you're going to do and that you actually have a mission plan. And I also just want to shout out this career guide again. It is such an important guide. I was blown away by it when it came out, and there is nothing like it in the career space. So if you're a career counselor and you're in this call, please go look at it. You know, please look at that guide. And if you're a trans or non-binary person who's job seeking, also go and look at that guide. So thank you to my fellow panelists and to you, Trick, and everybody that was here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jade. And yeah, Bina, Christine, and Jade, like, thank you all so much. What a wonderful conversation. That's the end of our panel discussion. I got a message from the admin team. It says, we are happily overwhelmed by the number of questions coming in through the Q&A. We will not be able to address all of them, obviously. If your question does not get addressed during the panel, or you have any follow-up questions after the event, you are welcome to email the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office at U of T, and the email address is in the chat box here. It's just sgdo@utoronto.ca. But for now, I am going to invite Sonia back to say a few closing words. Thanks, Sonia.
Awesome. Thank you so much again, Jade, Christine, Bina, and Trick, for sharing your insights and strategies with us. I definitely learned so much myself, and I'm so grateful for your labor and time addressing so many different pieces in our time together, from professionalism to self-advocacy and agency to really the importance of feeling safe and valued, you know, and guiding us all today in our collective responsibility to ensure that we work towards trans inclusion. As Trick has just mentioned, we've had so many questions in the Q&A and we couldn't address them all, but I do encourage all of you to read through your Journey a Career Guide for Trans and Non-Binary Students, as well as Transitioning Employers, a survey of policies and practices for trans-inclusive workplaces, as those resources do share a lot of valuable approaches, strategies, and practices to support trans inclusion, and may offer ways to address some of the questions that you still might be sitting with. Also, I just want to note that you will receive a post-event survey via email, which should only take a few minutes to fill out. So I do hope you'll be able to share your feedback with us, as we would love to learn about your experience today. We also wanted to take this opportunity to share with all of you an exciting upcoming networking event that will be hosted by Pride at Work Canada. And Jade, I'm hoping you might be able to step in to tell us a little bit about Matrices.
For sure. So Matrices is a trans, non-binary, and agender networking event that originally started as a breakfast here in Toronto in 2019. We were supposed to have our second in 2020, but I don't know what happened there. And so it's a really great space if you are trans, non-binary, and agender, really however you define yourself, as long as you don't identify explicitly and only with the gender you were assigned at birth. We welcome you. We're not going to gender police anybody. And it will start off with a presentation by Dizay, who's a really amazing Black non-binary fashion designer here in Toronto. And then we'll have breakout sessions to get to meet people, and there'll be people from across the country there. So love to have as many folks there as possible and really connect with you further.
Thank you so much, Jade. And I also want to share with everyone who's here today just some other links to upcoming events from the different partners who supported the creation of this event today. And so the links will also be shared in the chat window, but these are for the Institute for Gender and the Economy, Alumni Relations, the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office, as well as Career Exploration and Education. And with that, we are formally at the end of our time together today. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us for this dialogue. I hope you have a great rest of your day.